The Fw190 is probably quite a staple of the Airfix range in 1/72nd scale. It's been available through the years in a number of different boxings, and I've built a couple of these in the past, but never in this particular paint scheme. Hello everyone, Matt from Model Minutes here, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Airfix Fw190 in 1/72nd scale. German aircraft tend to have slightly more tricky paint schemes due to the amount of mottling that they have, and for this reason I thought this would be the perfect subject to try out a new airbrush. This NEOECO airbrush was sent to me free of charge for the purpose of review, however all opinions do remain my own, so I thought that this would be the perfect aircraft to give this airbrush a try on. This airbrush does come with a number of accessories, and is available in a variety of different colours. Having assembled the various parts, it would be attached to my compressor, and I'll use it throughout this build. Moving on to the model kit, I have done a detailed unboxing if you'd like to look a little more detail into what this kit contains, but in this build I'll be focusing on what it's like and rounding off with a review. As usual, a full list of all the products I used on the screen should help to give you an idea of what you might want to go and get if you fancy building this kit for yourself. But without any further ado, let's get into it. The first step was to remove the various components from the sprue using my cutters, and then sanding away any flash with a sanding stick or carefully trimming it away with a sharp knife. This is one of the older, kind of new toolings in the Airfix range, and as a result it does suffer from a little flash in a few places. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build, and my first steps were to focus on building up the cockpit interior. There are a number of small components here which build up to create a reasonably nice cockpit interior, which could then be glued into one half of the fuselage. The fit of the parts is generally quite good, but it is definitely worth dry fitting just to check things are going in the right places. There is a small brace component which holds the engine exhausts, which also go into place here. And then it was time to get a little paint through the airbrush for the first time. Vallejo Model Air RLM74 was added into the airbrush, and I did add a small amount of Humbrol acrylic thinner. Whilst the paint is airbrush ready, I find an extra drop of acrylic thinner should help prevent any tip dry. I will repeat this step for every Vallejo paint that I use during this build. The paints would be airbrushed onto the model between 10 and 20 psi. Lower pressure would be used later for finer work, but for general surfaces like this, the higher pressure was fine. With the cockpit sprayed, some Humbrol decal fix would be used to carefully apply the included decals for the control panel. The decals would have already been cut from the sheet, dipped in warm water and allowed to release from the backing paper. This is probably not the easiest step and would be much easier to do before assembling the cockpit, but actually it is possible to do it when it's in place like this. There are some small details which I can't airbrush, so some Vallejo matte black would be carefully hand painted on to pick them out. This included various panels and the control stick. I would also add the included pilot figure into the cockpit, which I've painted off camera using my normal techniques. The figure was then followed by the reflector gun sight. With that done, the fuselage halves would then join together. You might notice that there is a slight curve to the fuselage halves, but with some careful pressure and glue, you can actually get them to align quite well. The components which go on the nose of the aircraft were then added as well. There are some little gaps, which those with more attention to detail may want to address. The rear headrest components were then added as well, These have already been painted in the same colour as the cockpit. And then turning my attention to the lower wings. This kit does come with some holes marked on the lower sides, which can be drilled out for various armaments and things. In this particular kit, I'm going to add the underside drop tank. There are other holes in the wings for other weapons, but those are not included in this particular boxing. I do, however, have to open up some holes on the upper wing surfaces as well, which add covers for the outboard wing cannons. Another part of the engine exhausts need to be glued into the lower part of the wing, and then these blanking plates can be inserted as well. As mentioned, the upper gun bulges need to be glued into the holes which I drilled previously. The cannon barrels were then glued into place, with the inboard ones being glued through the landing gear bays and the outboard ones being glued into their hole in the edge of the wing. And it was at this point that the upper and lower wing halves could be cemented together. This was then followed by joining the fuselage onto the wings. The tail surfaces were next, being glued into the holes on the correct sides of the tail. I then added the footstep for the pilot to get into the plane. As I'm building this wheels down, I'm using all of the lowered landing gear options, but raised options are included if you would prefer to use them. With the underside pylon added for the drop tank which comes in two halves would then be glued together. And I will add it at this point to get a good plastic to plastic bond for the cement. For easier painting, you could leave this off. The clear canopy parts were then glued into place onto the model as well, and I've decided that I'm going to do this one with a closed canopy. You could position it open if you would prefer. And to mask the canopy, I've been out and bought this KV Models canopy mask set for this aircraft. These self-adhesive masks are printed onto a reasonably thick paper. It's not as thin as other products I've used, and I do question how effective they'll be. They do, however, seem to be sized correctly, so they were peeled from the sheet and then stuck onto the relevant panels. These masks don't cover quite all of the cockpit canopy, however, so the areas which aren't covered would be filled in with some Vallejo liquid mask. A thin layer of this would be applied into the relevant area and then left to dry. And now it's time to prime. This SMS Surfacer Grey would be loaded into the airbrush. As it's an acrylic lacquer, I didn't bother adding any thinner. This was then airbrushed over all of the remaining parts of the kit, including the propeller, engine components and landing gear, which I will build and add to the model a bit later on. Following this, I would repeat this step to paint the entire aircraft with it as well. This should hopefully give a nice surface for the next layers of paint to stick to. Vallejo Model Air isn't great at sticking to plastic surfaces, so this primer should help act as a key and ensure that it doesn't flake off. As a small note, whilst I've been using this airbrush, and it does seem to work quite well, I have found that as it has a valve underneath the cup, it doesn't fit into my holder. So this was quite annoying. Clearly I need a different stand for this one that accommodates this valve. The next paint I used would be some Outlaw Paint REF White, and this was used on the engine component. This part of the engine cowling needs to be painted white as per the painting instructions, so I did it at this point. Next, RLM 74 would be airbrushed into the landing gear bays. I then used the raised landing gear parts to act as masks, inserting them into the bays, and hopefully it will protect that paint. For the lower surfaces of this aircraft, I'm going with this RLM 76. This was loaded into the airbrush just as before, and then sprayed onto all of the lower surfaces. It was at this point I found that I did need to give my airbrush a bit of a clean. This airbrush does feature quite a long nozzle, which I found tended to build up quite a bit of paint. So I did have to make sure I flushed it out between colours. Whilst I'm giving it a clean actually, I'm going to swap out to the 0.2 needle set. This airbrush actually came with a number of different needles and nozzles. I have for the most part been using 0.3. It does come with a 0.5, but I didn't bother using that one because it was just a bit too big for my needs. But for the final work, I'm going to be using 0.2. RLM75 would be thinned down and added into the airbrush, and this would form the basis for the upper camouflage colour. Having swapped out to the finer needle, hopefully I should have better control over where I'm spraying the paint. I'm going to try and do everything here freehand to really test out this airbrush. I would attempt to do some mottling with this. It does have reasonably good control, and whilst I'm not the best at mottling, I'm generally quite happy with the results. I would build up the camouflage scheme as indicated on the painting instructions. The next colour would be RLM74, again loaded into the airbrush, and then applied freehand onto the upper surfaces. I did at times find I had to go back with some of the other colours just to clean up any overspray, which looked a bit untidy. But for the most part, I'm generally quite happy with how this airbrush is performing and the results that I'm achieving with these paints. With the finer paintwork done, it was time to swap back to the larger 0.3mm nozzle and needle set. RLM70 was loaded into the airbrush and then used on the propeller. And now to varnish the model, I'm going to be using this Outlaw Paint Gloss Clear. As mentioned, I have had to make sure I've given the airbrush a proper clean. As that nozzle is quite long, it can kind of store paint, so I needed to make sure there was no other colours stuck in the airbrush for when I applied this gloss, because otherwise it could ruin the finish. The gloss was sprayed over the entire model to help give it a smooth surface in preparation for the decals. Before we get to that point though, I did make sure to remove the raised landing gear parts which were acting as masks, and they seem to have done a fairly good job. With the gloss varnish applied and now completely cured, I moved on to the decal application stage. You only get one set of decals included in this kit, there's only one paint scheme, but the decals are printed by cartograph to a nice quality. They were soaked in warm water to help release them from the backing paper, and if you'd like to get your own brush water mug so you don't mix it up with your cup of tea, check out my merch store. It helps support the channel. Macro Scale, Set and Sol are my setting solutions in this build, and the decal application process is going to be pretty familiar to those of you who've seen my build videos before, so I won't spend too long talking about this step. In essence, the setting solutions were used in concert to help apply the transfers to the relevant areas of the model and help them soften down into the details. Perhaps the one which I struggled the most with would be the decal on the spinner. It can be a little fiddly to get looking right, but it kind of goes on. Perhaps it would have been better to paint the spiral on rather than use a transfer. I didn't really have any problems applying the decals. Perhaps it was a little bit tedious. There are some fine stencils, which although do help to elevate the look of the model, I did find them a little bit boring to put on the model. But that's just me, some people might enjoy that. I left the decals to cure, and whilst that was happening, some Ammo MIG gunmetal grey would be painted onto the gun barrels, taking care to try and avoid getting it anywhere it shouldn't. I'd also try and very carefully use this on the internal areas of the engine, avoiding that white outer band which I've already painted. Some Ammo MIG aluminium would be used to pick out some of the metallic parts such as on the landing gear here, the pitot tube on the wing, and to simulate a little bit of chipping in a few places. This should help give the impression that paint has been worn off by the ground crew who are working on the aircraft, or perhaps through the abrasive action of the air. I focus this primarily on areas which may have seen maintenance, with panels being removed or worn away by crew standing on various areas of the aircraft. With that done, this K-Colors semi-matte varnish was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed over the entire model to help dull down that gloss shine, whilst also protecting the transfers. It's not a completely matte varnish though, as I still want it a little smooth for the next step. And that next step is a tiny amount of weathering. This enamel blue-grey paint was thinned down with some white spirit to create a thin dark wash. This would then be painted over the entire aircraft and allowed to run into the recessed panel lines and details. This should help add an element of contrast, dirt and grime. Any excess that I wasn't happy with could be carefully removed using a cotton bud soaked in some more white spirit. I would paint the wheels with Vallejo black, and a small amount of gloss varnish could be used on the hubs, as those tended to be more glossy. I then added the landing gear components, which have been painted previously using the same internal colour that I used on the landing gear bays. I had to take care here to get the fiddly struts and things in the right places, and then finally the doors as well. The wheels could then be glued on as well, making sure that the flattened edge would be flush with the surface of the ground. This gives the impression that there's weight pushing through the tyres. The engine needs to be assembled now. This was relatively straightforward, with the various components being joined together, and if you're careful, the propeller should freely rotate once you've finished assembling it. I then pushed the engine assembly onto the nose of the aircraft. This Humbrol matte varnish is going to be used to dull down the slightly glossy surface and give a more uniform matte finish. I could have used a matte varnish through the airbrush, but at this point I was kind of a bit bored of airbrushing, so I decided that for ease, this matte varnish from a rattle can would do. And whilst I say that I was a bit bored of airbrushing, I actually thought I'd do one final step with the airbrush. I thinned down this black paint with the matte varnish, loaded it into the airbrush, and then carefully tried to create exhaust and gun smoke stains. This is my final test of the airbrush to see how well I can control it during this particular phase. I would streak the paint from the various areas which may have seen staining, and then travelled in the direction of airflow. It seems to work okay, and I kind of got to a point where I was happy with the results. The final step was to carefully remove the masks, which actually, despite being a little thicker than normal, seem to have actually done a reasonable job. I think that's probably down to the simple shape of the canopy, as I have experienced it on other KV model masks where they've allowed paint to sneak underneath, but in this case they seem to be okay. And with that, I'm going to call my build of this Airfix Fw190 in 1/72 scale complete. And there we have it, that's another build under the belt. So I've actually built this kit a number of times now, granted not in this particular paint scheme, but in the starter set, or rather gift set now, boxing. This is perhaps a step up in the complexity compared to the starter set or gift set option, as it does feature a slightly more complicated paint scheme with regards to the mottling. However, I still stand by my thought during the initial unboxing video I made that this is not a particularly exciting paint scheme for an Fw190. There are other more exciting schemes out there, and Airfix has done them in the past. Clearly for this particular version they wanted to go for a more muted paint scheme. I think though they must have also agreed with this sentiment because a more recent boxing of this kit does feature a more vibrant paint scheme once again. So first up, I want to talk about the kit itself. I do keep a log of everything that I do inside of my modelling journal. It's a book I've written a bit like a diary to keep a track of everything I do in my builds. If you'd like to get your own copy of the book and keep a track of your own builds, check out the links below the video. In here I have written down that despite this being a 2013 tooling, it still has a fairly nice level of detail, the moulding is still fairly crisp, and the moulding on the whole is fairly good. There was a slight warp with the fuselage, but with some careful glue and pressure being applied, it was able to get it to align neatly. The sprue gates are perhaps a little thick, so some tidying up will be needed in places, and as mentioned there may be a few gaps in a few places which the more eagle-eyed modeler might want to address, but in my case I didn't really see the need to bother with them. This particular boxing dates from 2019, and at a recommended retail price of £8.99, I don't think it's a particularly bad kit for a budget modeler. Granted, of course, it only comes with the single paint scheme, which may not be the most visually interesting, but I think in this particular case it was good at testing out that NEOECO airbrush. As this is probably one of the older kind of new Airfix kits dating from 2013, it's not quite up to the most modern standards that we expect from them in 2025. But on the whole, I still think this is a fairly acceptable model kit of the Fw190. If you did want a more exciting paint scheme for this model kit, I would definitely suggest you look around for one of the other boxings. I think the way that I've built this kit, it looks fairly good. I'm not the best at airbrushing at the moment, and I definitely need some more practice with mottling, but the results that I've managed to achieve here I'm actually quite content with. So let's do a little bit of a review on the NEOECO airbrush. So as mentioned, I generally use the airbrush with the paints being applied between 10 and 20 psi. Generally the higher psi would be used for overall coverage, whereas the lower one would be used for the more fine details such as the mottling. The lacquers I didn't bother thinning down, but the acrylics did have a drop of thinner just to prevent tip dry. I did actually clean between the colours I used. I flushed the airbrush with some cleaning fluid, I would wipe down the cup as well, and it generally seemed to be sufficient for a short while without having to be disassembled and then cleaned thoroughly. But I did have to clean the needle and cup and the nozzle out, as it did seem to accumulate it over time. That nozzle is quite long and it can store extra paint that you think you may have cleaned out of it. Positives of this airbrush are that generally it seems to work quite well and sprays in a fairly neat pattern. It does come with a good selection of accessories as well. It has 3 different needles and nozzles and different cups and things. It does have a movement limiter on the rear, which allows you to select how far back the needle goes, and it is dual action, so you have the benefit of being able to allow air to flow through before you introduce the paint. Some things that I wasn't particularly happy with were the fact that it has that extra bleed valve on the bottom underneath the cup, and that means it doesn't stand on my flush bottle properly. This was very frustrating and made it more difficult to clean out. This airbrush is a little bit larger and heavier than other products that I've used as well, which made it a little bit more cumbersome to use. And as mentioned, that nozzle being quite long did store some paint, which if you come to airbrush a gloss for example, you could inadvertently spray a different colour on whilst you're trying to put your gloss on instead. So if I had to round up my review on this airbrush, I'd say that this is a product that absolutely works. It would probably be suitable maybe as a beginner or intermediate airbrush for those who want a dual action, which comes with a good selection of accessories, which doesn't exactly retail for a high price. It's not perhaps as refined as more expensive products though, and being a bit large and chunky in comparison to other products from other companies, I'm not sure that it will become my permanent airbrush. Definitely, it's something that you could learn on, but I imagine in time you might move on to a more refined or expensive system. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this video. I'm generally quite happy with how this model kit looks. Granted, it's not the most exciting looking kit out there, but it was still reasonably nice to build. The airbrush as well worked okay, and it has helped paint this model to a good standard, but I'm not sure that this airbrush will become my default one that I'll use in the future. But what do you think of my build, and do you think my review of this kit and the airbrush was fair? Let me know what you think down in the comments. As always, a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them, check out the links in the description. You can help support the channel in other ways as well, and again, full info is below the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling video. And actually, you guys voted for this one in a recent poll on a community post. Being subscribed means that you might have the opportunity to take part in future polls in the future, so that you have the chance to shape the content that's featured on the channel. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll catch you on the workbench again next time.